So this is cellular respiration up here. Again, you've got some carbohydrate thing, or carbohydrate-like thing. You've got molecular oxygen, which is the oxidizing agent. And after you go through the process, you end up with CO2 and water, just like if you had burned a cube of sugar in the open air. In the process of this, NAD+ picks up electrons and is converted into NADH. So ultimately, some of the energy that's given off is trapped in this NADH, and the NADH is then available to electron transport chains so that ATP can be made from those electrons, or the energy associated with those electrons. And this, by contrast, down here is photosynthesis, and you can see this is basically the opposite. So rather than carbohydrate plus oxygen giving you CO2 and water plus energy, you have CO2, carbon dioxide plus water plus energy giving you carbohydrate and oxygen. And in the process here, you also have electrons that are being moved about, but rather than having NADH as the electron carrier, instead it's something called NADPH, which is very similar. It's just a phosphorylated NADH. NADPH in both animals and plants supplies electrons for anabolic processes, whereas NADH supplies the electrons for catabolic processes. It's just a way of, for some reason, the two things are separated out. So basically, one is a reverse of the other. And in fact, you can look at the process. So again, we've got now we've got photosynthesis on the top and cellular respiration on the bottom. Again, you can look at the processes as reverses of each other, but also from an ecological perspective, photosynthesis feeds into cellular respiration, which feeds into photosynthesis. So the plants take the energy of the sun, photons, and use that to take CO2 and water, to make oxygen, and this is what they're interested in, the carbohydrate, which is food for them, but also food for us. And we can take in this food and take and oxidize it, and in the process get useful energy in the form of ATP, plus carbon dioxide and water is given off. And ultimately, once we've used everything up and taken into account the second law of thermodynamics, and that is the inefficiencies of movement of energy from one form to another, ultimately the photons from the sun are converted into waste heat. So that's a very ecological perspective. But also ecological, we talked about how we eat the food that the plants produce for themselves, and also we utilize, when we're breathing in oxygen, we're breathing in oxygen that was produced by plants as well as algae and other organisms that photosynthesize like this. And when we give off CO2, that's the CO2, at least in part, that's picked up by the plants and the other producers that are going to make. So there's a cycling here. In fact, it's called the carbon cycle. It involves more than just plants and animals and things like that, but it's called the carbon cycle. And again, it's important to remember that plants have chloroplasts that do this photosynthesis, but plants also have mitochondria, which do cellular respiration. So they're a fully contained unit. They are making food for themselves, and then they're going through cellular respiration, using up that food. Whereas we're, in a sense, parasitizing. Not in a technical sense, but we're living off of the photosynthesis that the plants are doing for themselves. We're literally stealing the products of photosynthesis that plants are producing.